The sentence that changed everything. The city had seen scandals come and go. It had seen powerful men rise and fall. But the story of Alexander Grant and the waitress who defied him refused to fade. Instead of disappearing into the blur of yesterday's news, it deepened. It evolved. It grew into something larger than either of them. Weeks turned into months, and the sentence that had silenced him at Liupan was now painted on murals, printed on shirts, spoken in classrooms, and written on protest banners across the country. Respect is not written on your suit. It is written in your heart. Amara had never imagined her life would carry such weight. She still lived in her modest apartment, still carried the weight of responsibility for her younger brother, but now her days were filled with invitations, conferences, interviews, and forums. People looked to her for guidance not because she was rich or famous, but because she had spoken truth in a moment when truth mattered most. At times the attention overwhelmed her. She questioned if she was worthy, but then she remembered the night at Liupan, the silence, the trembling in her chest, and the courage that had risen despite her fear, and she knew she could not walk away. Her brother's recovery gave her strength. He had pulled through the illness, and she often told him that his fight gave her more courage than any crowd ever could. David Harrington remained by her side, guiding her with patience, reminding her that leadership was not about perfection but about sincerity. And Amara began to realize that her life was no longer just about survival. It was about service, about being a voice for those who had none. For Alexander, life was a storm of unraveling. His empire weakened with each passing month. Deals collapsed, investors fled, and the name that had once commanded respect now invited scorn. He found himself increasingly isolated. His phone rang less, his invitations dwindled, and the circles that had once celebrated him began to close their doors. Pride had built his walls, but now those walls had become his prison, and yet something inside him began to shift. The silence of his penthouse no longer screamed of victory, it whispered of regret. He thought of his childhood, of his mother who had once told him that money could open doors but only kindness could keep them open. He had forgotten that lesson in his hunger for dominance, but Amara's words had dragged it back to the surface. Night after night he replayed them. Respect is not written on your suit. It is written in your heart. And each time they chipped away at his pride. The breaking point came when he was invited, reluctantly, to a televised forum on leadership and respect, a forum where Amara was scheduled to speak. At first he refused, his pride still raw, but something in him told him this was the moment he could no longer avoid. Redemption or ruin, humanity or arrogance. The choice had to be made, and so he agreed. The night of the forum arrived. The hall filled with leaders, students, workers, and cameras broadcasting across the nation. Amara sat quietly at the side, her heart steady. She had spoken before, but tonight felt different. Tonight she knew the man who had humiliated her would share the same stage. She wondered if he would lash out again, or if he would remain silent. She told herself it did not matter. She would speak her truth regardless. When she stepped onto the stage, the hall grew still. She spoke not of Alexander, but of dignity, of the unseen struggles of workers, of the power of kindness, of the responsibility that comes with privilege. Her words flowed with the sincerity of someone who had lived every syllable. The audience leaned forward, cameras capturing her face, her voice steady, her message undeniable. When she finished, the hall erupted in applause. Then came Alexander's turn. He walked slowly onto the stage, no longer with the stride of arrogance, but with the weight of a man who had been broken. He looked out at the crowd, their eyes sharp, waiting, judging, and for a long moment he said nothing. Only the sound of his breath filling the microphone when he finally spoke. His voice was lower than the world had ever heard. "I built an empire," he began, "but in doing so I forgot what makes us human. I forgot that respect is not something you can buy. It is something you must live." A ripple moved through the audience. He paused, his gaze flickering toward Amara. "The truth is, I was humbled by someone I tried to humiliate. She reminded me that power without respect is emptiness, and though it has cost me more than I could have imagined, I stand here tonight to admit that she was right." Amara's breath caught. The crowd murmured. The cameras captured every second. Alexander continued, "I do not ask for forgiveness. I know I must earn it. But I will not hide behind pride anymore. If I am to rebuild, it will not be with arrogance, but with humility." Silence followed, a silence that carried weight. Then slowly applause began, hesitant at first, then louder, filling the hall. Not applause of celebration, but of acknowledgement, of recognition that even the proud can bend. Amara rose, the cameras catching her as she stepped forward. She looked at Alexander, their eyes meeting once more, but this time not in anger, not in defiance, but in understanding. She leaned into the microphone and spoke softly. The sentence that started all this was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to remind us all. Respect is not written on your suit. It is written in your heart. If you carry that truth forward, then maybe this story was not about humiliation but about change. The hall erupted, the crowd on its feet, the words echoing across screens, across cities, across hearts. Alexander bowed his head, humbled, and Amara stood tall, not as a waitress, not as a victim, but as a voice that had changed the course of lives. In the days that followed, debates filled the nation. Some doubted Alexander's sincerity. Others believed it was the beginning of his redemption. But one truth was undeniable. Amara's words had become a legacy. They had proven that courage could rise from the most unexpected places, and that dignity could silence even the most powerful. For Amara, life would never be the same, but she embraced it with humility, knowing that her strength came not from fame but from truth. For Alexander, the road ahead was uncertain, but he had taken the first step toward becoming a man his own heart could respect. And so the story closed not with defeat, but with transformation. A reminder that one sentence, spoken with courage, can shake empires, heal wounds, and change the world. Redemption or ruin. Alexander Grant had always been a man of certainties. He believed in numbers, in contracts, in power that could be measured in billions. But as the weeks turned into months after that night at Leopold, certainty slipped from his grasp. The empire he had built trembled under the weight of a waitress's sentence, and no amount of money could steady it. Investors lost confidence. Partners stepped back. Employees whispered when he entered the room, and headlines painted him as a symbol of arrogance. For the first time, Alexander found himself alone. He still lived in the vast penthouse above Manhattan, glass walls opening to the skyline, polished marble floors echoing under his steps. But the silence of that space no longer felt like victory. It felt like a cage. He wandered from room to room, restless, his reflection chasing him across every window, and each time he looked, he did not see the man of control and dominance. He saw a man cracking under shame. He tried to drown it in routine, bury himself in deals, remind himself that wealth was power. Yet the truth was clear. His wealth no longer protected him from judgment. For years he had hidden behind his empire, but now it seemed smaller than ever. He thought of Amara, the words she had spoken, the way she had looked at him not with fear but with quiet strength, and something in him stirred that he had long buried, a sense that maybe he was not invincible. Maybe he was simply human on the other side of the city. Amara was facing her own test. Her life had changed beyond recognition. She was no longer invisible. She was invited to speak at schools, community halls, even small conferences. Her sentence had become a rallying cry, and people looked at her as though she carried answers. But Amara still lived in a small apartment, still woke early to cook for her brother, still fought exhaustion with every step. She was not a celebrity. She was simply surviving while the world tried to place her on a pedestal. And then came the moment that shook her. Her younger brother, only 12, fell ill one night. His breathing shallow, his body trembling with fever. Panic gripped Amara as she rushed him to the hospital, sitting by his bedside with fear etched into her soul. All the speeches, all the applause, all the attention of the world felt meaningless in that moment. All she wanted was for her brother to open his eyes and smile again. As she sat there through the night holding his hand, Amara realized how fragile life was. She had spoken about dignity and respect. She had stood against power, but none of that could protect her from the helplessness of watching someone she loved suffer. She prayed silently, tears slipping down her cheeks. Her courage tested not by words or crowds, but by the fear of loss. The news of her brother's illness spread quietly. David Harrington ensured that she had support, paying for medical bills, arranging the best doctors, reminding her that she was not alone. Yet the struggle weighed heavily on her heart. It reminded her that behind the public's admiration, she was still just a sister fighting to hold her family together. Alexander learned of her brother's illness through the whispers of his network, and something in him shifted. Pride told him to ignore it, to focus on rebuilding his empire, but another voice inside him, one he had long silenced, urged him to act. For nights he wrestled with the thought, pacing his penthouse as guilt gnawed at him. He remembered the fire in her eyes, the sentence that had shattered him, and he wondered if perhaps the only way to quiet the storm was not through force, but through humility. One evening, unable to fight it anymore, Alexander left his penthouse without an entourage, without the armor of his suits and cars. He walked through the city streets like any other man, his steps heavy, his mind uncertain, until he found himself at the hospital where Amara's brother lay. He stood at the entrance for a long time, staring at the sliding doors. wrestling with pride that screamed at him to turn back, yet he could not. Something deeper pulled him forward. When he finally stepped inside, the nurses looked at him with surprise, whispers following him down the hall. He asked quietly for the room, and when he reached the door, he stopped, his hand hovering over the handle. Inside was the woman who had undone him, the woman who had forced him to face the emptiness of his power. He could walk away and no one would know he had come, but he pushed the door open. Amara looked up, exhaustion in her eyes, shock spreading across her face as she saw Alexander Grant standing there. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of their history filling the room. Alexander cleared his throat, his voice lower than she had ever heard it. "I heard about your brother," he said. "I just wanted to see if he was all right." Amara stared at him, disbelief and anger rising, but also confusion. She had expected arrogance, not hesitation. She answered carefully, "He's fighting." Her voice cracked slightly. "That's all that matters." Alexander nodded, his gaze falling to the boy in the bed, tubes running to his small frame. The sight pierced something in him, something money had never touched. He felt the fragility of life, the futility of pride. He turned back to Amara, words pressing at his lips but pride still choking them. He wanted to say he was sorry. He wanted to admit he had been wrong, but the chains of his ego held him back instead. He placed a small envelope on the table beside her. "For the bills," he muttered, then turned toward the door. Amara's voice stopped him, soft but sharp. "I don't need your money, Mr. Grant. I need respect." He froze, her words cutting through him once more. He left without replying, but as he stepped back into the night, he felt the weight heavier than ever that night. As Amara held her brother's hand, she realized that Alexander was at a crossroads, redemption or ruin, pride or humanity, and though she could not choose for him, she sensed that their stories were bound together, that the final test was still ahead. The breaking point, the weeks that followed the community forum, were unlike anything Amara had ever known. Her life, once measured by the ticking of shifts and the scraping together of tips, had suddenly taken on a rhythm she could not control. Her name spread into conversations she had never imagined. Students repeated her words in classrooms. Workers carried them into break rooms, and strangers wrote them on signs held high in demonstrations about fairness and dignity. Her sentence had broken free from the walls of Liupan and become a banner of resilience. At first, Amara struggled to understand why it mattered so much to others. She had not spoken to inspire a movement. She had spoken only to defend her own dignity. But the world had a way of taking a moment and magnifying it into meaning. People saw in her not just a waitress but a reminder of their own voices, the voices they had been forced to silence under the weight of power. Her courage became their courage, and so her life was no longer hers alone. It was tethered to the hopes of strangers who believed she had lit a small flame in a world that often felt cold. For Alexander Grant, the flame was fire. It spread into his boardrooms, his shareholder meetings, his private circles, and no matter how many statements his team released, no matter how much money he spent on public relations, the phrase would not die. "Respect is not written on your suit. It is written in your heart." Appeared on billboards painted by activists, on social media banners, even in graffiti sprayed across walls in cities he had never set foot in. Every repetition was a fresh wound, every echo a reminder that his image was slipping out of his control. The first cracks appeared in his business empire. One partner quietly withdrew from a merger, citing concerns over public image. Another halted a joint project that had been in preparation for years. His advisors urged him to apologize, to appear humble, to repair what had been broken, but Alexander's pride would not allow it. He told himself that time would erase the noise, that money would silence the crowd. Yet with every passing week, the noise grew louder. Amara, meanwhile, began receiving invitations to speak. Schools wanted her to talk to students about courage. Community centers wanted her to share her story. Even a small television network reached out to feature her on a program about resilience. At first she hesitated, worried that she was stepping into a world she did not belong to. But David Harrington reminded her that she had already proven her worth. He told her that the world was not asking her to be perfect, only to be honest, and so she stepped forward. Each time trembling, but each time growing stronger. Her brother watched with pride, his young eyes shining as he saw his sister not just as the woman who carried their home on her back, but as someone the world admired. He began to dream bigger because she dared to stand taller, and Amara, though still exhausted by the grind of work and responsibility, felt a new kind of energy rising in her, the energy that comes when one realizes their struggle might be for something greater than themselves. Alexander's breaking point came one morning when he opened the financial news. Headlines declared his company's stock had fallen sharply, not because of market forces, but because public trust in him had collapsed. His empire had always stood on the illusion of strength, but illusions cannot survive when the crowd sees the cracks. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander felt powerless. A man who had commanded boardrooms and silenced rivals now sat in his penthouse, staring at numbers slipping out of his grasp. He raged, he cursed, he shattered a glass against the wall, but when the storm inside him quieted, he was left with silence. The same silence that had fallen over Liupon when Amara spoke her sentence. He realized that all his fury could not erase her words, that his anger only made them stronger. He saw in the mirror not the titan of industry he had always believed himself to be, but a man slowly being undone by a truth he could not fight. The world outside no longer bowed to his wealth. Reporters hounded him with questions. Protesters gathered outside his buildings. Investors demanded explanations, and everywhere he turned he saw reminders of her. The waitress he had dismissed as nothing, now standing taller than him in the eyes of the public. His pride, his shield for so many years, had become his prison, trapping him in a cycle of denial and bitterness for Amara. The breaking point came not in anger but in realization. As she stood on a small stage in a crowded community hall one evening, she looked out at the faces before her, people of all ages and walks of life, and she understood that this was no longer about her and Alexander Grant. This was about everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or disrespected. Her one sentence had become theirs, and with that realization came a weight, the weight of responsibility. She could not go back to being invisible, not now, not ever, and so, as Alexander's empire shook and Amara's voice grew, their fates intertwined more tightly, both standing on the edge of change, one resisting it with every fiber of pride, the other embracing it with every breath of courage, both reaching a breaking point that would decide what kind of people they truly were. A test of character. The world was restless, and though the city of New York rarely paused for any single story, this one had found a way to cling to the streets. People who had never set foot inside Liupon now spoke of the billionaire and the waitress, their voices spilling across subway rides, filling coffee shops and echoing in university halls. It was not the scandal itself that captured them. It was the sentence, that single line spoken with quiet courage. Respect is not written on your suit, it is written in your heart. It had become a refrain that resonated with anyone who had ever been overlooked or underestimated. Amara continued to live her life with the same rhythm. Mornings at the cafe, evenings at Liupon, caring for her younger brother in between. Yet she began to notice strangers looking at her differently. Some customers smiled at her with recognition. Others whispered her words back to her as though she had become a symbol of defiance they secretly admired. She felt uneasy at times. She never asked for attention. But deep down she also felt a growing sense of responsibility, as if the world was waiting for her to decide what her next step would be. David Harrington did not forget her. Within a week of their meeting, he sent an invitation to Amara, asking her to attend a community forum he was hosting in Harlem. The event was about resilience and leadership, and though she hesitated at first, the thought of stepping into a space where her words might matter more than a tray convinced her to accept. She told herself it would be just one night, a chance to listen, to learn, to see if perhaps her life could be more than just shifts and survival. On the night of the event, Amara dressed in her simple best, a modest blouse and skirt, her hair tied back neatly. She felt out of place as she entered the hall, the room filled with activists, entrepreneurs, teachers, and students. Yet when David introduced her to the audience, explaining how a single sentence had humbled a man of immense power, she felt a wave of energy she had never known before. The crowd clapped not out of pity but out of respect. They did not see her as a waitress. They saw her as a voice of courage when she was asked to speak. Amara's hands trembled, her throat tightened, but as she looked out into the faces waiting for her, she remembered the silence of Liupon, the weight of Alexander's glare, and the strength that had risen in her then. She began slowly, speaking about dignity, about how everyone deserved to be seen and treated with respect no matter their job, their skin, or their status. Her words flowed not like a rehearsed speech but like truth drawn from the depths of her struggle. The audience leaned in, drawn to her sincerity. They cheered softly when she spoke of her late mother teaching her that strength was not in wealth, but in kindness. They nodded when she described the exhaustion of working endless shifts to care for her brother. They grew quiet when she confessed how humiliating it felt to be treated as invisible, but how necessary it was to stand tall even in those moments. By the time she finished, the hall erupted in applause, not the kind given to celebrities but the kind given to someone who reminded them of their own worth. Unknown to Amara, Alexander Grant had heard about the forum. Pride and fury drove him there. He sat at the back of the hall in a dark suit, watching as the very woman who had humiliated him now stood on a stage commanding admiration. Every cheer from the audience felt like a dagger. Every nod of agreement felt like betrayal. He could not believe how quickly the narrative had turned, how his power seemed smaller in the face of her honesty. When the forum ended, David introduced Amara to leaders and business owners, people who offered advice, encouragement, and opportunities. Alexander watched from the shadows, his fists clenched, his mind spinning. He could not let this stand. He was Alexander Grant. He had built empires, and yet here she was, threatening to undo his image with nothing more than her truth. Finally, as the crowd began to disperse, Alexander approached, his presence drawing gasps from those who recognized him. Amara turned, startled to see him there. Their eyes locked once again, and the room seemed to shrink. He spoke with a controlled voice, colder than the winter wind. "You think this makes you powerful? You think one sentence can undo me? But you have no idea who you're dealing with." Amara's chest tightened, but she did not back away. She had faced his rage once before, and though fear flickered inside her, courage rose again. She answered calmly, "I never wanted to undo you, sir. I only wanted to remind you that power without respect is empty." Her words carried across the room, and the silence that followed echoed the night at Liupon. This time, however, the crowd was behind her. Murmurs spread. People stared at Alexander not with admiration but with judgment. And for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of public disapproval pressing on his shoulders. He turned sharply, leaving the hall without another word, his pride bruised deeper than before that night. As Amara walked home under the streetlights, she felt both shaken and strengthened. She knew the path ahead would not be easy, that men like Alexander Grant did not surrender their pride quietly. But she also knew something had changed. She was no longer just a waitress trying to survive. She had become a voice others were listening to, and voices once heard could not easily be silenced for Alexander. The walk back to his waiting car felt heavier than any boardroom defeat. He could not escape her words. He could not escape the eyes of the crowd. He could not escape the truth that for all his wealth and power, he was being undone by something he had never valued. Respect. The test of character had begun, not only for Amara but for Alexander as well, and the outcome would decide far more than either of them yet understood. The tables turned. The city of New York had always thrived on stories. Some were born in boardrooms, some in back alleys, some on stages. But the story of a billionaire silenced by a waitress was unlike anything the city had tasted before. It spread like a secret everyone wanted to share. First whispered in cafes, then murmured in offices, then echoed in digital spaces where millions of voices gathered. What had begun as a private confrontation inside Liupon was now becoming a symbol far larger than its origin. Amara Johnson still moved through her days unaware of the scale of the storm. She worked her shifts at the cafe near Brooklyn in the mornings, then hurried back to Liupon in the evenings. Her hands were always busy, scrubbing, serving, cleaning, and her mind was always on her brother, her rent, and the endless line of bills that seemed to stalk her. But in quiet moments, she sometimes replayed that night in her head, the look in Alexander's eyes, the silence that followed her words. She did not think of herself as brave. She thought only that she had done what was necessary, what her dignity demanded. Yet outside her small circle, the world was beginning to see her differently. On news blogs, her words were quoted. On social feeds, they were shared with captions like "strength in silence" and "dignity louder than wealth." The short clip of her voice played again and again across countless screens, her face blurred by some who wished to protect her privacy, but her sentence shining clear. Respect is not written on your suit. It is written in your heart. For Alexander Grant, the days following the incident were like walking through glass. Each step cut deeper. He could not escape the phrase. Not in his offices, not in his cars, not even in the stillness of his penthouse. His advisors tried to assure him that the noise would fade, that people always moved on to the next scandal. But Alexander sensed something different. This was not just scandal, it was humiliation. And humiliation had a way of clinging to the soul. Meetings grew tense. Partners asked questions he could not answer. Was it true? Did he really speak that way? Investors expressed concern, not for his character, but for the impact on his empire's image. It infuriated him. He had built his name on dominance, on control, on being untouchable. And now the world was laughing at him because of a single waitress. He vowed to erase it, to bury it under power. But the harder he pushed, the more the story seemed to grow. One evening, while Amara was finishing her shift, A man in his 50s entered Leopold. Unlike the usual patrons, he carried no air of arrogance, yet his presence commanded respect. His name was David Harrington, an entrepreneur who had built his fortune in technology but had never abandoned his roots. He believed in people, in resilience, in the power of character over appearance. He had heard the whispers of the confrontation. He had seen the video, and something about the young woman's quiet strength had moved him. David watched as Amara moved gracefully between tables, carrying trays, smiling softly, enduring the weight of long hours with patience. He saw in her what others might miss, the resilience of someone who had been forced to stand tall even when life tried to bend her low. When she approached his table, he greeted her kindly, asked about her night, and treated her not as a server but as a human being. It startled Amara at first, but she answered politely, her eyes reflecting gratitude for the simple act of respect. After the meal, David requested a moment with her. She hesitated, uncertain why a man like him would wish to speak to her. But curiosity outweighed caution. They stepped aside near the entrance and he spoke plainly. "I watched what happened here the other night," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I want you to know that your words reached further than you realize. You spoke truth to power in a way most people only dream of, and that matters." Amara looked down, embarrassed. "I didn't mean to make a scene," she whispered. I couldn't let him treat me like I was nothing." David nodded, his eyes kind. "That is exactly why it matters. You reminded everyone watching that dignity cannot be bought, and that courage does not come from wealth but from the heart." He handed her a card, embossed with his company's name. "When you are ready, I would like to speak to you about an opportunity, one that could change more than just your life." Amara accepted the card with trembling fingers. Unsure what to say, she tucked it into her pocket, her mind already racing. What could a man like him possibly want from her? She was just a waitress, but deep down, a spark of curiosity and hope began to flicker. As David left, Alexander Grant entered, his eyes narrowing as he noticed Amara speaking with someone who clearly carried influence. His pride twisted, jealousy mingled with anger. He did not like seeing her treated with respect. It reminded him too sharply of the words that haunted him. He sat at his usual corner table, but his appetite was gone. He watched her every move, feeling a storm he could not control rising within him. That night, as Amara walked home through the city streets, the card still in her pocket, she felt the world shift. She did not know why, she did not know how, but something inside her told her that the confrontation with Alexander Grant was not an ending. It was a beginning. She thought of her brother sleeping soundly at home. She thought of her late mother's words about courage, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream of a future where her voice mattered. On the other side of the city, Alexander stood on his balcony staring at the skyline. The lights of Manhattan spread like jewels below, but all he felt was the weight of his own shadow. The empire he had built felt fragile now. Fragile because of a woman he had dismissed as insignificant. His phone buzzed again, more headlines, more reminders. His reflection in the glass looked back at him, cold and proud. But for the first time, he wondered if the man staring back was already beginning to crack. The tables were turning, slowly but surely. Power was shifting in ways neither of them yet understood. A billionaire was losing control. A waitress was finding her voice, and fate was quietly setting the stage for a collision that would reach far beyond the walls of a restaurant. The shattered silence. The night was quiet yet alive in downtown Manhattan, the kind of night when the city seemed to breathe with elegance. Neon lights shimmered along the avenues. Carriages of yellow taxis flowed like rivers of light, and laughter drifted out of rooftop bars. But inside Leopold, the most exclusive dining spot in the district, silence would soon take command. Leopold was not just a restaurant, it was a stage for the powerful, a place where deals worth billions were whispered over glasses of aged wine, where the clink of cutlery seemed rehearsed, and where reputation mattered more than the taste of food. The chandeliers glittered like frozen fire, each crystal catching the dimmed golden glow. Tables clothed in white linen stretched across the hall, and every chair seemed to carry an invisible crown. Only the wealthiest could sit there, and tonight among them sat Alexander Grant. Alexander Grant was not a man who went unnoticed. Tall, broad-shouldered, his presence commanded attention. He was the kind of billionaire who did not just buy companies, he bought silence. He bought fear. His name was printed on the tallest towers in New York. He was known for closing deals that crushed rivals and building empires that swallowed competitors. He dressed in navy-tailored suits that cost more than most workers earned in a year, and he walked with the air of a man who had never heard the word no. But tonight, something different was about to unfold. Something money could not control at the far side of the restaurant. Amara Johnson balanced a tray in her hands. She moved between the tables with practiced grace, her black hair tied neatly behind her head, her uniform crisp, her smile gentle though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. Amara was not like the people she served. She did not belong to the world of chandeliers and billion-dollar conversations. Her life was one of subway rides, double shifts and dreams too heavy to carry. Yet here she was carrying trays for the powerful, trying to provide for her younger brother, trying to keep hope alive. Her steps brought her to Alexander's table. He sat surrounded by two men in suits and a woman in a glittering gown. They were laughing before she arrived. But when Amara placed the glass of wine before him, something shifted. Perhaps it was the tiniest mistake, a drop of wine trembling at the rim. Perhaps it was nothing at all, but to Alexander Grant, it was an insult. His laugh stopped, his face stiffened. His hand struck the table with such force that glasses rattled, and in that instant, Lupin Fro's fork stopped halfway to lips. Waiters paused in mid-stride. Every eye in the hall turned to the corner table where power had risen like a storm. Alexander Grant stood, his navy suit gleaming under the chandelier. His face flushed crimson with rage. He towered over Amara, his shadow falling across her like a wall. "I don't understand," his voice boomed. "How a place as prestigious as Lupin can hire someone like you to serve me." The words sliced through the silence, each syllable sharp. His gaze swept over her as if she were unworthy of even existing in his sight. Amara froze. The tray in her hand trembled. Her heart pounded, her knees wanted to give way, yet she held herself upright. The sting of his words burned, but she would not show weakness. The room held its breath, waiting for her to collapse, waiting for her to stammer an apology, waiting for the billionaire to finish his humiliation. But Amara did not fall. Her lips parted, her voice soft yet steady, and she spoke one sentence. "Sir," she said, her eyes locking with his. "Respect is not written on your suit, it is written in your heart." A hush deeper than silence fell, the kind that seemed to erase sound itself. Alexander blinked, stunned. His lips parted, but no words came. The entire restaurant sat frozen, eyes darting between the billionaire and the waitress who dared, for the first time in his life, to answer him with dignity rather than fear. The chandeliers above seemed to shimmer differently, softer, as if the light itself was listening. The two men beside Alexander shifted uncomfortably. The woman in the gown lowered her gaze, and at other tables, whispers began to spark like fire on dry grass. Amara did not flinch. She held the tray steady now, her shoulders straight, though her heart still thundered in her chest. She had not planned those words. They rose from the part of her soul that had been silenced too long, the part that carried years of being dismissed, overlooked and stepped upon in that moment. She spoke not only for herself, but for every unseen worker who had ever been treated as invisible. Alexander's eyes narrowed. His pride battled with disbelief. Never had anyone spoken to him like that. Not in public, not in private, and certainly not someone he considered beneath him. He wanted to roar, to crush her with another insult, but the weight of silence in the room pinned him. He felt the stares of the wealthy, of strangers, of people he had never cared to notice, all judging him now. The waitress had turned the tables with a single sentence. He leaned closer, his voice low but heavy. "Do you know who I am?" he hissed. Amara did not flinch. "A man who forgot that kindness is worth more than money," she replied. The whispers grew louder. The tide of the room was shifting, and for the first time, Alexander Grant felt the burn of shame rise like fire to his throat. He clenched his jaw, turned sharply, and sat back down, his fists tight against the table. But the moment had already been carved into memory. The moment a billionaire was humbled not by another tycoon, not by a rival empire, but by a single sentence from a woman carrying a tray. And somewhere deep inside, though he would not admit it, Alexander Grant felt the first crack in the armor he had built his entire life. The night at Lupin was far from over, but the story had only just begun. Whispers and wounds. The echo of Amara's words still lingered in the air long after the restaurant tried to return to its rhythm. Conversations resumed in half tones. Cutlery tapped plates again and glasses clinked softly, but the atmosphere was forever changed. It was like the aftermath of a storm, calm on the surface yet heavy with memory. No one could forget what they had just witnessed, a billionaire rising in fury and a waitress replying with words that pierced deeper than any insult. At one table, a pair of investment bankers leaned closer to each other, whispering about what they had seen. They spoke not of Alexander's power or his empire, but of the look in his eyes when he was silenced by a woman he had tried to humiliate. At another table, a journalist who frequented Lupin sat stunned. Scribbling mental notes, he knew this story would travel if told. It was not just gossip, it was a mirror held up to power. Amara walked back toward the kitchen. Her steps steady, though inside she felt a tremor running through her veins. Her heart still thudded against her ribs. She had not planned to speak, she had only reacted. Yet now those words played again and again in her head. Respect is not written on your suit. It is written in your heart. She knew she had said something that could not be taken back. But strangely, she did not regret it. In the kitchen, her co-workers crowded around her, some eyes wide with fear, others glimmering with pride. One whispered that she should be careful, that men like Alexander Grant could destroy lives with a phone call. Another told her she was brave, that nobody had ever spoken to him that way. Amara nodded but said nothing. She felt both fear and calm, fear for what might come. Calm because at least for once she had defended her dignity. Meanwhile, at the corner table, Alexander sat stiff in his chair, his jaw set, the veins in his temple still visible. His companions tried to distract him with conversation, but he barely responded. His mind was spinning. How could this happen to him? He had been insulted before, but always behind his back, never to his face, never by someone who had no power. Yet the sting of her words lingered more than any rival's attack. The restaurant's manager, a nervous man in a black suit, rushed to the table, apologizing endlessly to Alexander, offering to remove the waitress to erase the problem. But Alexander lifted a hand and stopped him. His pride would not let him admit that he had been shaken. He told the manager in a clipped tone to leave it alone. Though his voice betrayed a storm beneath, by the next morning, whispers had already leaked beyond the polished walls of Liupon. Someone had recorded a short clip on their phone. Not the full confrontation, but just enough. Alexander's raised voice, the trembling tray, and the soft but steady reply. Respect is not written on your suit. It is written in your heart. The video made its way through private group chats, then into social feeds, and soon thousands of strangers were watching, debating and reacting. Amara did not know any of this yet. She woke early for her second job, tired but determined. Her younger brother still asleep in their small apartment. She looked at his face and remembered why she worked so hard, why she endured so much. She packed her things quietly and left, unaware that the world outside was beginning to speak her name. On the other side of the city, Alexander sat in his penthouse, the skyline of Manhattan stretching before him like a crown. He sipped coffee, but it tasted bitter. He tried to focus on the reports laid out on his glass table, quarterly earnings, expansion deals, contracts waiting for his signature, but none of it could silence the sentence that replayed in his mind. Respect is not written on your suit. It is written in your heart. He had spent his whole life building a fortress of wealth and reputation, yet those words pierced through as if the walls were made of paper. His phone buzzed. Messages from associates, partners, even old rivals, some subtle, some mocking, all hinting that they had seen something. Alexander clenched the device until his knuckles whitened. He hated the feeling. He hated that one waitress had managed to shake the empire of Alexander Grant with nothing more than a sentence. At Lupon, staff members gathered in small groups whispering about Amara. Some admired her courage, some feared the consequences. The manager paced nervously, wondering if the billionaire would call and demand retribution, but the call never came. Alexander Grant did not seek revenge immediately. Instead, he retreated into silence, a silence heavier than anger. Days passed. The clip spread wider, millions of views now, strangers debating online, some praising Amara for her courage, others questioning her boldness, but one thing was certain. The power balance had shifted. Alexander Grant was no longer untouchable. He was a man who had been challenged, and the world had seen it. Amara, however, remained unaware of the storm building around her. She only knew the weight of her bills, the long hours of her shifts, and the quiet responsibility of raising her brother. Yet somewhere deep inside, she felt a change. She could not name it, but it was there, a sense that her life was about to move in a direction she had never imagined. And for Alexander, the whispers had become wounds, wounds that his wealth could not heal. He tried to drown them with meetings, with power plays, with the cold comfort of luxury, but the echo of that sentence followed him into every room, every mirror, every thought. The stage was being set, not by design, not by power, but by a single moment when a billionaire yelled and a waitress replied. A moment that would ripple outward, shaking lives, testing hearts, and changing everything.